Good morning. Always great to be in Kansas City. I'm Charles Davis from the University of Missouri. Thanks to Hallmark for shedding a little light on digital storytelling. That video, I think, opens up the day very nicely. We are all, I think, trying to get our minds and our brains around digital storytelling as it emerges as a medium. And we're going to spend the day trying to think about these things. I run a program over at the University of Missouri called the Media of the Future program. It's under the Office of the Provost. I won't bore you with the academies. Suffice to say, what we are doing is working very hard around digital storytelling as one of our initiatives in reaching out across the university and working with the world. We are very much open for business at the University of Missouri. So if you are interested in thinking about working with us in teaching tomorrow's students some of these emerging technologies, I want to talk to you today. So please look me up. It's my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce today's keynote speaker, Frank Rose. Frank Rose is a global authority on the future of media. He gained his perspective as contributing editor at Wired magazine and has authored many books, including his latest, The Art of Immersion, which I highly recommend, where he argues that we are seeing the emergence of a new form of narrative storytelling. He wrote The Art of Immersion after spending nearly a decade as a contributing editor at Wired, reporting on the impact of technology on media and entertainment. Along the way, he covered such stories as the making of Avatar, Sony's enormous gamble on the PlayStation 3, Samsung and the rise of the Korean techno state, and the posthumous career of Philip K. Dick in Hollywood, a must-read, in fact. In The Art of Immersion, longtime Wired contributing editor Rose talks to the people who are reshaping media for a two-way world. People like Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse of Lost and James Cameron of Avatar fame. These communicative, interactive, two-way communications, he says, are literally creating a new form of mass media, and I could not agree more. And so without further ado, I give you Frank Rose.
Thank you. Hi. Great to be here in Kansas City. So, as you've just heard, I wrote this book called The Art of Immersion. And essentially, it's about how the way we tell stories is changing. I think what's happening really is that we're gradually developing a form of storytelling that's native to the internet. In the same way that the sitcom is native to TV or that the feature film is native to cinema. But what that should look like is not really all that easy to figure out, and there's no end of ways to go awry. Here's one of them. This is a relic from the very early days of digital. A company called Interfilm. This is the DVD version, but first it was released as a movie. And the idea was that you could combine a movie with a video game. Sounded great. You have two popular media, even share largely the same demographic. So all you really need to do is make movies interactive. What could be simpler than that? It was sort of the choose-your-own-ending approach, and we're all familiar with that idea. So this guy named Bob Bejan got really excited about the possibilities. And he got some theaters together in New York and LA, and what he did was he replaced the cup holders with buttons. There was a red button, a green button, and a yellow button. And at certain points in the movie, the audience could, press one of those buttons and decide what happens next. So if the hero is cornered on the roof, for example, you could press green if you want him to run to the open door. You could press yellow if you want him to jump to the next roof, or you could press red if you want him to pull out his badge and announce that he's actually a secret agent. Now, Bejan was not shy about the magnitude of his accomplishment. There were, however, a couple of problems with it. The first problem was that the movies totally sucked. Roger Ebert, in one of his kinder moments, described them as moronic and defensive. The second problem was that almost nobody came. And the third problem was that the people who did come got so excited about the idea of changing the course of the movie that they started leaping over rows of seats and grabbing extra buttons to register their vote. So the theater quickly descended into chaos. So I think if you want to reinvent storytelling, this is not the way to go about it. But why do we need to reinvent storytelling anyway? Stories have been around for thousands of years. We've been telling stories long before we could even write them down. Stories, in fact, are a defining characteristic of humans. And we've told the same stories throughout the ages, through different cultures. Little Red Riding Hood, for example, surfaced at least as early as 13th century France and Italy, and was clearly related to other tales in other cultures like Peter and the Wolf in Russia and old Norse myths from an even earlier time. Somewhat remarkably, in almost all versions, the little girl wears a red cap or a hood. And there have been many interpretations of this. Some have argued that the story is really about rape. Others have interpreted it as a coming-of-age tale, a sort of a parable of sexual awakening. But while the underlying myth may remain the same, the way that the story is told has changed a lot with the technology at hand. For centuries, it was handed down from one generation to the next. But then in 1697, it was written down by a man named Charles Perrault. Perrault was a very famous literary figure in France at the time, and he published this in his book, The Tales of Mother Goose, Mother Goose being a common term for nanny at the time. The story was later retold by the Brothers Grimm in Germany, and it became part of a literary culture, which is quite different from the oral culture that had produced it. What this shows, I think, is that storytelling is inexplicably bound up with technology. Every form of storytelling is a product of the technology at hand and the economic forces that are generated by that technology. So what I want to do now is take a few minutes and look at how that technology has evolved and how it's gotten us to where we are today. Now, sometimes it takes a while for technology to take effect. It was centuries after the invention of the printing press and movable type, around 1450, before you had a form of storytelling that was really native to the printed page. I'm talking about the novel. The novel was called that because it was new. It was a whole new type of story. And it wasn't history, it wasn't myth, it wasn't legend. For the first time, stories were told that provided a window into the lives of other people, ordinary people. Now, like all new media, the novel wasn't accepted at first. In 1719, when Daniel Defoe published Robinson Crusoe, which is the first novel in the English language, he denied that it was a novel at all. The problem was that novels were so new that there wasn't even a category for them. They were classified with history, but they had the distinct disadvantage of not being true. So they were actually a defective form of history. And so in the preface to this first novel that he wrote, he denied that there was any fiction in it. Nonetheless, people followed his example. And eventually they started coming out of the closet. Richardson, Fielding, Jane Austen. And then there was this guy, Charles Dickens, shown here at the age of 27 in 1839. Dickens was the master of serial fiction, which is to say novels that were published in installments. And serial fiction was a pure product of the technology of his day. By the mid-1830s in England, you had vastly improved ways of manufacturing paper. You had much better printing presses than ever available before. You had railways, which meant that there was an efficient and dependable distribution system. And you had mass industrialization, which brought thousands of people into the cities to find jobs. And when they came to the cities, they learned how to read. Something that people in the country, most people in the country, had never been able to do before. So they became readers. They became a market for books, but they couldn't afford books. They didn't make that much money. What they could do was buy them on the installment plan, so to speak. They could buy them as monthly magazines. And so innovative publishers saw a solution here, which was to publish books as serials, monthly serials. And all of Dickens's books were published this way. Now, when that happened, there were certain unforeseen consequences, as there often are when we leap into a new technology. And the consequence in this case was that the time between installments, the month that passed, gave readers a voice. It gave them a chance to react to the characters, react to the plot developments, and send their thoughts in by the mail. In 1841, when he was 29 years old, Dickens got so excited about all this that he started a publication called Master Humphrey's Clock, which was not monthly but weekly, to, as he said, referring to himself in the third person, to shorten the intervals of communication between himself and his readers. Now, over time, when serials and Dickens himself were long gone, people forgot what that meant. People forgot what the advantages were. But his biographers knew, and his biographers remembered. They knew that he drew sustenance from the constant give and take with his readers. Eventually, however, that give and take became harder to maintain. Economic and technological forces, the same forces that made serial fiction possible in the 1830s, they didn't stop there. In the 1840s, there were continuing advances in printing presses. Yochai Benkler of Harvard, in his book, The Wealth of Networks, quite remarkable book, by the way, points out that you went from being able to print 500 sheets of paper an hour to 12,000 sheets of paper an hour. But with that advance came a staggering increase in cost. In 1835, you could start a newspaper in the US for the equivalent of $10,000 in today's currency. By 1850, that cost had gone up to $2.5 million. And so you had the advent of papers like this one. This is the first issue of the New York Times. It came out in September 1851. And you had the advent of media as we've known it for most of our lifetimes, which is to say, mass media. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, you could reach hundreds of thousands, ultimately millions of people. It was efficient, it was mechanistic, and it was very, very costly. It created a rigid hierarchy of producers and consumers, the few speaking to the many. Now, there was nothing natural about telling stories this way. It was simply a product of the technology that produced it. What that technology made possible, and how that technology trained us to think that a few of us should be producers of stories and that everyone else should be consumers of stories, with very little opportunity for feedback. So there were more inventions over time. The phonograph, the motion picture camera. Entertainment became mechanized. By the 1920s, you had the arrival of what was called Hollywood, the Dream Factory. Here you see the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank in an old postcard. The front office on the left, at the center are the sound stages, and at the rear, looking kind of like a strip mine, is the back lot where they had sets of old New York and the Wild West and so forth. This was really a vast industrial complex devoted to the mass production of fantasy. But to do that, to make this fantasy work, what they had to do was invent a new grammar of storytelling, what we call now the grammar of cinema. It's a lot of things that we completely take for granted. We don't even think about when we watch a movie or, for that matter, a TV show or a video. Things like cuts and pans and fades and point of view shots. The very first movies were shot from a camera that was placed right there in the middle of the audience and was completely stationary. It was called the proscenium arch shot. But after a while, people figured out how they could actually use the motion picture camera, how they could take advantage of its possibilities. And of course, until you had a camera, none of those things were possible. They all had to be invented. Now, throughout most of history, storytelling had been more or less participatory. People told stories to one another, they shared them with one another. Now, with newspapers, books, movies, records, and ultimately with television, all you could do was consume them. And pretty soon, that became to seem the natural order of things. Just as the invention of the movie camera produced Hollywood musicals and thrillers and police dramas, television produced a form of story called the sitcom. It was a very specific format that required 3 cameras so you could shoot from multiple angles in just 1 or 2 takes and then very quickly edit it together. It also required likable characters, the sort of people that you'd want to invite into your home. And then to go along with it, advertisers invented the 30-second spot to interrupt it. The spot would tout the benefits of this or that product and hammer the message home, as in this sort of classic ad for Anacin, which promised fast, fast, fast relief for the headache they've just given you. And the networks, the television networks, were in the business of delivering eyeballs to advertisers. The viewers sat passively in the living room. They were eyeballs being funneled like ping pong balls from one show to the next, from one day part to the next, from early evening to prime time, all the way to late night. It was before the remote, it was too much trouble to get up and change channels most of the time. So instead they sat there and they consumed what was shown to them. They consumed the shows, they consumed the ads, they consumed the Coke, and they consumed the newspaper. For media companies, like television networks and newspaper and magazine publishers, ad revenues went up and up and up until, at a certain point, they didn't anymore. Now, in 1950, about the time that that photo that you just saw was taken, ad revenues for newspapers in the US totaled about $20 million. By 2000, they were triple that. And now, a dozen years later, they're back down to 20 million and still falling. Just about the most dramatic decline has been in classifieds. Help Wanteds went from $8.7 million in 2000 to $0.7 million, all in 11 years. Now, as you probably all know, classifieds used to be the backbone of most newspapers. Every time somebody advertised for a job or put their house up for sale, it went toward funding a little more reporting in Vietnam or on the Watergate scandal. But then comes the internet, and this guy named Craig shows up. Craigslist didn't set out to destroy newspapers. It didn't even set out to make a buck. Craig Newmark just thought, gee, wouldn't it be cool if people could advertise their stuff for free? And guess what? It was cool, and they took him up on it. And Craigslist is just one example of the kind of thing that's happening. It looks like an explosion from some vantage points. In fact, this is how the internet looks from the Hubble Space Telescope. The thing about the internet is it's not just one-to-many like the mass media of the 20th century. It's also many-to-many and many-to-one. It's not just one medium, it's all media. It's type, it's photos, it's drawings, it's video, it's maps, all mingled in together. And it's dynamic and participatory. Viewers are not just eyeballs anymore, they're users. And just as there was nothing preordained about mass media, there was no law of physics that created it. There's no law of physics that's creating what's happening now. It's just an accident at the intersection of technology and economics. But out of that accident, the first accident came all the institutions we've used for the past 150 years, the institutions we've used for storytelling. That era is now ending, and it causes a lot of grief. But it also turns out there's a lot of good news in that. So you might ask, what do I mean? Newspapers are collapsing, advertising is in turmoil, television is clearly next. The entire economic basis of storytelling is being is being threatened, even as the grammar of storytelling, how you do it, is being reinvented. So how is that good news? Well, in a couple of different ways. First, suddenly storytelling is open to anyone. Let's look at journalism for a couple of minutes. If you want to start a newspaper today, or more likely a blog, you can do it for a lot less than $10,000. If you want to put up a Facebook page like this one, you can do it for free. Now, obviously, you won't have the resources of a major newspaper, but you can still have influence. The Trayvon Martin case hardly caused a ripple in the mass media. An unarmed black kid shot to death in a small southern town, and the sheriff makes no arrests. This is not exactly news. News, by definition, is something that doesn't happen all the time. News is man bites dog. And yet, a month after the fact, the story exploded in the media because of the pressure that came out of social media, which suggests that we're dealing with an entirely different form of reading public. People who are no longer consumers, and that means that forward-looking papers have to start inviting their readers in. This past February, The Guardian newspaper in the UK launched what it called its open journalism platform. It's all about an exchange of ideas, not just stories told by the newspaper to the readers, but ideas coming from the readers to the paper as well. Recovering, to go back to the Dickens example, that intimate relationship between storyteller and audience. Because now the technology makes it possible. Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, says this is the only real option for media in the digital era. That the newspaper that stays closed off is going to have to try and generate everything itself, and that just isn't possible anymore, nor is it wise. And contrast that with the attitude of Bill Keller, who until quite recently was the executive editor of the New York Times. Keller said that readers get what they pay for with citizen journalism. He said, if I need my appendix out, I'm not going to go to a citizen surgeon. Well, he has a good point. However, I went to journalism school, and while I consider it a very valuable experience, I never felt like I was learning to perform brain surgery. Or even abdominal surgery. Now, if Mr. Keller is ever stricken with appendicitis and needs my services, I'd be happy to offer them such as they are. But the truth is that journalism is not like surgery of any sort. Journalism benefits from many voices. What you see here is a still from a video that The Guardian did for its open journalism platform. And the video dramatized the bizarre twists and turns of the fictional Three Little Pigs murder case. In fact, however, the fictional Three Little Pigs murder case echoed some real-life events. 3 years ago, there was a news vendor who died during the G20 riots in London, a man named Ian Tomlinson. Nobody really knew what happened. He just like dropped dead in the middle of the riots. The Guardian's investigative reporter worked the story for days. He had eyewitness accounts, but nothing that really contradicted the official version, that the man simply collapsed in the street and died. But then the reporter sent out a tweet asking for help. And a New York banker who had been there that day saw his tweet and reached out to say that he had a video of a riot squad officer striking Tomlinson. The paper posted the video. The official story crumbled, and this month, the officer is finally standing trial for manslaughter. The second thing about storytelling today is it's not just open to anyone, it can be done anywhere. Power and influence are no longer concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, a few companies, or a few cities. Neither is creativity. Let's look at entertainment for a few minutes. A couple of years ago, this iPhone app came out, what you see on the lower left. It was a app that was related to a popular show, a popular comedy show on the BBC. The show was called The Thick of It, and it featured a character named Malcolm Tucker as the expletive-shouting spin doctor for number 10 Downing Street. The app was called Malcolm Tucker, The Missing iPhone. You can imagine what Malcolm Tucker's missing phone might contain and what might happen if it got into the wrong hands. And that's what the idea of the app was, that you had somehow stumbled across Malcolm Tucker's lost cell phone, and that you find it packed with incriminating emails, voicemails, text messages, attachments, enough stuff, in short, to bring down the entire government. Now, the idea for the Malcolm Tucker iPhone app came from a guy named Dave Addy, who heads a 6-person app shop in a small town in the English Midlands called Leamington Spa. You've probably never heard of it, and frankly, neither had I. But he was working with Faber & Faber, the book publisher, on another project, and this idea came up. So he met with the creator and writers of the show, and together they came up with this conceit. What if this character lost his government-issued smartphone? They realized that this was a real opportunity for storytelling. And the writers loved the idea because for them, cell phones are a whole new medium. Now, thirdly, storytelling is not just open to anybody, anywhere, because digital means you can try anything you want. You're free to experiment. Here we have a website for something called the Department of Human Management, which is related, as you might guess if you read the fine print, to something called the Strain Trilogy, which is a series of books by Chuck Hogan and Guillermo del Toro. Volume 3, which came out shortly before this went up, it's called The Night Eternal. And in Volume 3, not to do too much of a spoiler, the vampires have taken over. And the guy who created this website was thinking, as he put it to me, you can imagine what this means, but you're not quite sure. So what he set out to do was to demonstrate what it means. Now, his name is Andy Merkin, and he's certainly connected. He has a degree from MIT, a master's. He studied with Henry Jenkins, who's one of the, probably the leading academic theorist of of this form of storytelling. And he works at Murata Studios in LA, which is a studio that Guillermo del Toro set up specifically to do this sort of thing. But connections won't help if you can't see the opportunities. And so what Andy did was he pushed to focus on the world-building aspect of this story. The authors had created this world, so let's think it through. What would life be like if you were actually in it? Now, the same focus on building out a digital road came out when I was talking with Matt Locke, who's a consultant in Brighton on the south coast of England. Matt was working with Faber and Faber on a novel called Capital by John Lanchester. Capital documents the lives of a group of residents of a gentrified street in South London called Pepys Road as they deal with Britain's ongoing financial crisis. Economists there have been predicting a sort of a lost decade, they call it, as a result of government cutbacks. So what if you personalized the story through some sort of game? What if you brought it home to the readers in a way? Show how your life might be affected by the events that are taking place in this book. As Matt said, the point is to take people inside the story world. Let's look at advertising for a minute. I was in Sydney a couple of months ago. I was speaking at AdTech there, and I was walking back to the hotel late at night, and pondering the great questions of life, like why is it that most people love brands but hate advertising? And that's when I saw this. It was on a bus shelter. I pulled out my trusty iPhone and snapped it. It's an ad for Weve, which is the #1 energy drink in Australia and New Zealand. And the entire message on the ad is what you see at the top. Advertising equals, hey you, plus buy this. So it's so meta, right? I mean, hard to resist. But the thing about this ad is that it means exactly the opposite of what it says. Advertising today doesn't equal, hey you, plus buy this at all. It used to back in the days of those Anison ads, the ads that offered fast, fast, fast relief. But the very fact that you would see this as an ad slogan on a billboard means that advertising today has to be done with a wink. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is the most innovative ad campaign of the current decade to date. Wieden & Kennedy, well-known agency, large independent agency in Portland, Oregon, created the man your man could smell like for Old Spice. And the original series of ads, which aired in February and March of 2010, starred this guy named Isaiah Mustafa, who was a football player, in fact, a football player that no one had ever heard of. But they quickly turned him into a pop culture sensation because these spots did what TV ads have to do now. They were so entertaining that rather than serve as TV spots that people want to skip, they served as YouTube videos that people liked so much that they wanted to share them with their friends. But after a while, the agency started thinking, what could you do with this next? And in particular, how could you enable viewers to connect with Isaiah Mustafa? That's when they came up with the idea of the Old Spice response videos. For 2 days, the agency creatives and a team from the client and some camera people and sound people and so forth holed up in a building in downtown Portland, and they took questions on Twitter. So then they shot instant responses to as many of these questions as they could. What happened was the whole thing turned into a game. People started competing to send in the best questions. You got questions from people like Kevin Rose, the founder of Dig, from Cliff Bleszinski, the creator of Gears of War, one of the top-selling video games of the past decade. And it also created a dialogue with viewers. And the result of all that was from February to the end of July. February was when they started the original campaign. The end of July was when the response, shortly after the response videos ended, they got 130 million views on YouTube. Now, frankly, this is incredibly daring. I mean, you know, there are not many advertisers that are willing to let a bunch of people go into a warehouse and come up with instant videos that they post online. It required a great deal of trust between the agency and the client, and it also required all of them to be at the top of their game. It was risky, but it was certainly memorable. And at a time when all the old rules have stopped working, when we're all in new territory, trying to feel our way, risk is kind of what you need to take. Now, unfortunately, this campaign happened 2 years ago, and no one has been willing to do anything this innovative since. But I think the most important thing to take away here is that we need to embrace what's happening, and we need to learn how to turn it to our advantage. You want to not fight it, because there are forces way bigger than you are at work. This is what happened to an industry that did fight it. This chart shows US music sales over the past dozen years. Pretty much a roller coaster ride, all downhill. And it was the same pattern throughout most of the world. 1999 was the high point for the music business. It was when digital music moved from CDs to MP3s. And when that happened, the music companies declared war on piracy, on illicit file sharing. Sounded reasonable, you know, how could people be allowed to do this? So they shut down Napster. They prosecuted many of their most devoted fans because what they failed to take into account, even after it was pointed out time and again, was that the people who did the most file sharing online were also the people who bought the most music. This didn't fit into their model of the world, so they simply rejected it. The other thing that they did was they failed to make other options available. For years, there was no legitimate way to buy music online. They said that music was like blue jeans, and you wouldn't steal blue jeans, would you? Well, no, you wouldn't. But the truth is that music is not like blue jeans. And I can prove it. On the left, you see a pair of blue jeans. On the right, you see a digital music file. Now, you notice that the music is completely immaterial. It's just some electrons rattling around inside a computer. The record labels were not actually in the business of selling music. That was probably the source of their confusion. They were in the business of selling CDs, which are in fact kind of like blue jeans. CDs are something that lost value, not gained it from being shared. And the label saw no reason to change. They didn't realize that they were moving from a world in which they sold stuff to a world in which they were selling an experience. Now, I don't mean to pick all that much on the music business. That certainly makes a tempting target. We're all used to thinking that whatever world we're in is the way things ought to be, the natural way. But that's not ever the case. It's always just an accident. The world of mass media was an accident at the intersection of technology and economics. It produced certain effects that we came to see as beneficial. And whether they were beneficial or not, and not all of them were beneficial, they were familiar because we got used to them over time. My point here is that music is not like blue jeans. Neither are stories, neither is storytelling. Neither is any of the stuff we do online. You need to make money doing it, yes, and most of us at least do. But you also need to find a way to bring people in, to involve them. You need to make it a social experience. I once heard someone at a colloquy not unlike this one say that mass media is antisocial. I thought it was a very good summation. Because digital media is nothing if not social. It enables you to recover that intimate relationship between storyteller and audience that motivated Dickens, and that goes back to our earliest forms of storytelling. In fact, it doesn't just enable you to do this. It demands that you do it. It insists that you do it. Because we've entered a new world. There's no going back. And like any new world, it can be scary at times, but it's also exciting. One more thing that's exciting about it is we get to reinvent storytelling. How many times does that happen? How many generations have had that kind of opportunity? In the 1950s with television, in the very early years of the 20th century with movies, first with silent films and with talkies, and before that in the 19th century with newspapers and novels. But it doesn't happen very often. And for people who can engage with the future, for people who are prepared to deal with it, the rewards will be breathtaking. Notice that I said not see into the future, because none of us can really do that, but engage with it. And if you're ready to engage, the world is ready for you. Thank you. So I don't know if there are any questions, but if anybody has some, I'm happy to.
I have a bunch of questions. Could you talk a little bit more about some? Oh, thank you. About some different applications, I guess, apart from applications and smartphones, like some unusual new ways of storytelling that you've seen context for it.
Sure.
Whether it's video games, I think, are particularly interesting.
Yeah, I think video games are very interesting. The thing is that people have been trying, people in the game business in particular, have been trying for 15 years or so to marry games and storytelling. And the unfortunate part is that it turns out to be very hard to do because, with games, you're the hero. The player, obviously, is the hero of the story. And to a large extent, the player determines what happens next. One solution to this is, cutscenes. I'm sure you're familiar with that. That's the part where, the action is taken away from the gamer for, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes as long as half an hour, and you just sit there and passively watch a movie. Hideo Kojima has been, famous for this, but it's not very satisfying. It's just, suddenly you switch from playing a game to watching a video. And I was kind of obsessed, actually, with the relationship between stories and games, and I really wanted to get at the bottom of it. and understand, why it wasn't working so well and maybe, how it could work. And it wasn't until I spoke to Will Wright that I really began to understand it. Will Wright, of course, is the creator of The Sims, which is, I think, still the #1 best-selling computer game of all time. And in The Sims, it's not a video game in the should I say, traditional sense, in that you have you go through levels and end up winning something. What happens is you create a world and you create characters, you set the rules, and then you watch what happens. And Will pointed me to a blog that somebody had set up who had done this. A guy in Cambridge, England, who had created a Sims in which he created these two characters, a man and his daughter, a grown daughter. He took all their money away and he left them homeless and sleeping in a park. And he left the father kind of, not terribly with it mentally. And the daughter was kind of depressed and angry. So then you watch what happens. And what happens was that people got very, very involved in the story that emerged, to the point that they started writing in to the guy who had created all this stuff. He kept blogging about it for a couple of years. Ultimately, this becomes like sports. The thing about sports is, it's a million stories. Every time you watch a ball game or play in a ball game or do anything like this, you come away with stories. And stories emerge from games in this way. And I think that's what, I think that's the real relationship between stories and games. There are certainly, there are other things that you can do. I mean, alternate reality games have become very big. I can go into that if you want, but
Some other examples of interesting phone applications, smartphones, new smartphone applications, stuff like that you've seen that are cool.
Yeah, I can't say off the top of my head I've seen other smartphone applications. I'm sure there are. Not exactly storytelling, but the Bjork application, for her latest album is certainly engaging and involving. There's clearly lots you can do with this.
Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm trying to project my voice. You talked about the creator of the first interactive movie.
Uh-huh.
Has he given up? Wouldn't there be more of a market for something like that now, especially with children and home entertainment?
Right. There might be for something like this, especially like DVDs for children. I haven't seen anything like it. He went on to work at Microsoft for a while, and then he started his own agency in LA. And I'm not sure exactly what they do. I can't say they've made a big splash, but this was, I mean, in terms of children, yeah, I think there's perhaps some possibility for that, and there's certainly lots of possibilities for games that engage children and teach them. That's, I spoke to a neuroscientist at the University of Bristol in England who's done a lot of work in that, and it turns out that children are much more engaged when rather than, for example, rather than being given a point whenever they get a right answer, they can decide if they want to do that or if they want to have a 50-50 chance of getting that point. It makes them much more attentive to what they're doing. Mm-hmm.
It seems ironic that you're in a theater talking this story.
Totally.
Have you thought about what it is about live theater that seems to have resisted the benefits of technology? This is not too different than what the Greeks might have attended.
Right, exactly. I have thought about that a lot, and it's really interesting. I think that a lot of what is happening now is that whether it's in the digital realm or the physical realm, digital technology encourages us to go back to that, to those formats. As Dickens' biographer said, the kind of interplay that existed in the days of Chaucer. I think that as we spend more and more of our times online and looking at screens and engaging with one another through screens, I think there's been, at the same time, a rise in sort of a fascination with the physical world. I think it's why people come to gatherings like this. I think it's, frankly, you could go from one tech conference to another, it's like throughout the calendar year, and your feet would never touch the ground. That's how big these things are. And the same with live music, the same with lots of these sorts of things. I think that what's valued is what's scarce, and as we spend more and more of our times online, this kind of direct physical interaction becomes more and more scarce, and therefore more valued.
Can I just build on that real quick? I think what you're doing right now, live theater, was the original interactive storytelling, because your audience will feed you laughter, applause, or dead silence.
Yeah, right. No, I totally agree. Yeah.
About the old Spice commercial. How many of those turned into real sales of that 130 million views?
I was afraid somebody would ask that. Somewhere in my files, I have an answer, but if you would like me to get back to you, I'd be happy to do so. I think it was considered a successful campaign. One of, however, the most ironic things about it, Old Spice, its biggest competitor is from another, global packaged goods conglomerate, Unilever, and they have the Axe brand. And when the Old Spice commercials started turning up on YouTube, of course, Google now takes ads for YouTube videos, and who was advertising on the Old Spice commercials but Axe? Yes.
I have a question, and I have the microphone, so I guess I'll just jump in
Okay.
here. I want to know if you can comment on the digital files for posterity, in the sense that, digital files require electronics and software and the appropriate this, that, and the other thing, and they frequently become obsolete and you can't view them anymore, and so on, compared to printed word that you only need eyeballs to see the photo or the printed word. I mean, do you think about where does that go in the potential for losing so much electronic data as time passes and files become obsolete and that type of thing?
Right. No, I think that's a very good question, and I don't have the answer to it, but I will say it's sort of somewhat analogous to what happened with film. There are many early movies that are kind of turning to dust in warehouses in LA somewhere, and there are been well publicized efforts to save some of them, but the vast majority, I don't think they've managed to do that. I've written books that I can no longer access the electronic files for, but I think that the important data will be, I can't promise this, but my suspicion is the important data, or at least the economically important data, will be made available and will be updated. You know, we'll see how this happens, but it's certainly something to be cognizant of.
Okay, you were talking about basically having viewers in the journalism field, having viewers involved with providing content for like an online journalism website.
Mm-hmm.
How do you continue upholding like a lack of editorialization and using AP style if you're starting to have users contribute blogs or just contributing articles and stuff like that? How do you keep that standard of truth
Right.
and efficiency up?
No, that's also a very good question. I think that you know, what the Guardian is doing is not really, you know, they're not really having users post their own stories or anything like that. And I think that's a very important distinction. I think that, you know, what they're doing is sort of creating a dialogue between the, or creating the possibility of a dialogue between the reporters and the readers. And their thinking is that there's always, there's much more information out there than one person, even a professionally trained reporter, can get. As this video that I recounted earlier demonstrated. That's quite different from from just opening up your columns or your web pages to let people post anything they want to. That said, both The Guardian and Le Monde in Paris have created blogging platforms for people. Anybody can go there and create a blog, just as you can go to TypePad or WordPress and create a blog. It obviously doesn't carry the same authority that something the paper publishes carries. Sometimes, if something is, if the editors consider something particularly good, they'll feature it on the website. But there's a clear distinction, I think, between what the paper publishes and what readers publish on the blogging platform. And I think there has to be. Mm-hmm.
Hi. I'm a creative director at an agency here in Kansas City called VML, and we spend day in and day out thinking about the things that you've been talking about today. And one of the things that we focus a lot on is not just how people are behaving today, but how it has changed us as human beings over the past 5 years. And a lot of times when we go to our clients and try to get them to do something unique, we'll go back and just say, think about, when you launched your website in 2007, the iPhone didn't even exist, right? And what that's done just in those few years. So what I'd be interested in your opinion on what this is doing to us as people, and what do you think is going to happen to us as people, the things that may impact us as human beings in the next few years?
Right. Well, I think that's a little hard to say, but certainly, no reason not to ask. I think it's a very good question to ask, and I think that I think it has like any technology, it has some beneficial effects and some not so beneficial effects. When I see people, this has obviously increasingly been happening in the past year or so, but with the proliferation of smartphones, everybody is now walking down the streets staring at their phones, myself included, and that's not really a very good habit. I can tell you why it happens. It happens because, frankly, email is not unlike a slot machine. Slot machines are very carefully designed to activate a particular sort of neurological response, which is that if you're engaged in some activity and you don't get any rewards from it, after a while you lose interest. And if you get a reward all the time, you'll kind of lose interest as well. what really keeps your interest is if sometimes you get a little reward and sometimes you get nothing and occasionally you get a really, really big reward. And that's what slot machines are like. And you know, frankly, that's what email and texting and all of that stuff is like. You know, all of this form of communication. So it's very easy to get sucked into that. At the same time, the idea that was popularized in a recent book and magazine article is Google making us stupid. You know, I don't buy that. I think that the same thing was said about the book at first. The same thing was said about the alphabet. You know, in ancient Greece, once they started writing things down, people complained that you know, no one would remember the stories anymore. And in a way, it was true. But at the same time, this memory aid known as writing enabled us to access many, many more stories than we were ever able to before. And you know, all technologies since have done the same. So, you know, whenever some technology like this threatens to make us stupid, I think we simply respond by redefining stupid. And I think that's going to be what happens with Google too. Like pretty soon it won't matter very much if you can't remember you know, who was the female lead in Inception or something like that. So,
What's going to happen to the print newspaper? It seems like the minute that a newspaper talks about going digital or we're going on the web, their first response is to cut the staff and then say, well, we've got a wonderful thing. We're not sure exactly how we're going to handle this, but it's wonderful. I know what's been in the news the last couple of weeks is the Time-Picayune and their parent company has eliminated 600 positions and eliminating, I believe, or coming out only 3 times a week. And then they're pointing out that in New Orleans, at least a third, if not half, the population does not have computers. Does this also going to create a citizenship where you have the knowledgeable people, the people who are aware of what's going on, and the people who are basically depending either on secondhand information or no information at all?
The short answer is yes. And you know, I think we already have that situation. You know, I think what's happening now is just making it worse. I've been around the news business for a while. It's been you know, a very, very, very long time since I was a daily reporter. Basically, that was in college. But I've certainly kept abreast of it, not least because I have, you know, friends who are, you know, who work for the local paper where I come from in Virginia. And I've watched as that paper and just about every other paper, with a handful of exceptions, has shrunk over the years. I'd say there are a lot of culprits here. Most newspaper companies, most newspaper publishers have had an addiction to double-digit profit margins, which is something that you see in very, very few industries. So when the double-digit profit margin is threatened, they respond by cutting the news hole. In other words, making less pages and you know, having less reporters and less editors to fill them. I think, you know, this has happened to an extent that by the time the internet came along, many newspapers were so hollowed out that they you know, ceased to be terribly important anyway. I'm talking about, you know, sort of small and smaller, medium-sized dailies. At the same time, the internet made it possible for at least anybody who did have access to a computer to read not just the local paper, but you know, the New York Times, the Times of London, the Washington Post, you know, all of these things that were much harder to come by before. So there came to be a certain redundancy in reporting that was no longer really necessary. And then you had things like developments like the Tribune Company buying the LA Times and hollowing it out, and Sam Zell buying the Tribune Company. And frankly, I think when you get to people like Sam Zell, it's like if the internet hadn't come along, like these people would have had to invent it to justify their failures. So I think it's, maybe it's lucky for them that it did. But, all of which is not to make light of your question at all. I think that especially in a city like New Orleans, that's a very real problem. And I think that many newspapers, too many newspapers, have abdicated their responsibility over the years, and if they continue to do so, they're only going to become more and more irrelevant. And what will happen is people will find other ways of finding information. I'm a firm believer in markets, not necessarily the way capitalism is always practiced, but in the idea of markets. And I feel that if there's a market for something, it will be filled. I think people really want local news. People want to know what's happening around them. And if they don't get it from the newspaper, they'll get it from somewhere else.
Frank, we have time for one more question, and got it right here.
To kind of follow up on that same journalistic economic problem that we're facing, there was a fellow with Occupy who wanted to get a 24-hour feed going, and he crowdsourced to get the economic funding for doing that. Are you familiar with this fellow?
I'm not familiar with him, but I'm certainly familiar with the idea, yeah.
Yeah, he got batteries that were donated and even food donated. I just wonder if you could speak to the technology involved in using your phone to provide a feed and also get funding and provide journalism.
Well, I think crowdsourcing is one of the most, I think, interesting and powerful developments. And it has obviously variants like crowdfunding. The term was actually devised by a friend of mine who was also at Wired at the time, a few years back, named Jeff Howe, who now teaches at Northeastern. And I think that this kind of thing shows exactly the possibilities that the internet provides for routing around institutions that are unresponsive, and for people going direct to the source, whether it's whether it's a source of funding, whether it's a source of information, whether it's a source of goods, food, that sort of thing. And mobile phones have just essentially mobile phones now are just miniaturized computers, and their capabilities are obviously growing month by month. And I mean, this is one of the reasons that I think it's an incredibly exciting period to be alive and active in all this, because this sort of thing is being invented all the time. And I think what newspapers have to do, what news organizations have to do, and certainly organizations like the Knight Foundation are very much in the forefront of this, and there are many others, is just be aware of this and keep track of it, and try to spur it along as much as possible, and make sure that that these sorts of innovations get spread as widely as possible. I think that's what we really have to focus on. Thanks a lot. Thank you.